Started in the interest of time because we were cutting it fine in the last session. So welcome to your February CPD on mechanical restraint, an effective collaboration between occupational therapists and positive behaviour support practitioners. My name is Ellie Riley and I am the clinical lead for positive behaviour support at Ability Action. And with me, I have Tracy McInnes, who is the OT clinical lead. Before we make a start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet to learn today. For me, that's the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. A reminder that Ability Action Australia is for everyone. So if you do have access and inclusion needs that you need to bring to our attention so that you can participate fully in today's session, please do so in the way that is most comfortable for you. And because today's topic will touch on restrictive practice, this can be difficult for people that support people who live with disability or have been exposed to restrictive practices in their lifetime. So if you need to, you are welcome to step out. You can reach out to debrief with either myself or Tracy or contact Ability Action Australia's EAP services. We have listed some additional support lines here if you need them as well. So we're going to start off with a general overview of restrictive practices, just to orient the occupational therapists on the call to what this means and how it relates to mechanical restraint today. So the NDIS Act defines restrictive practice as any practice or intervention that has the effect of restricting the rights or freedom of movement of a person with disability. And not because I'm lazy, but because it is much better an explanation, I am just going to share my screen with this short video.
Why do you hold my hand down?
Did you lock your fridge in your house?
Why you look guy in a bathroom?
Restrictive practice is the use of interventions and practices that limit a person's rights or freedom of movement.
Examples of restrictive practice are used in many different environments, including schools, hospitals and aged care services.
Some restrictive practices you may have heard of are physical restraint, chemical restraint, mechanical restraint and seclusion.
There are also some other types of restrictive practices that you might not have heard of, like restricted access.
Like locking things away?
All states and territories and the federal governments have signed an agreement to reduce and eliminate the use of restrictive practices.
In these films, we're going to talk about ways that restrictive practices are used with people with disability.
Restrictive practices are typically only used as a part of an approved support plan for people with a disability.
A common reason they are approved is because there is significant risk of someone harming themselves or other people.
If restrictive practices are used, they must only be used as the last resort, and the least restrictive action must be taken.
Plans must be monitored and reviewed regularly with the aim of reducing restriction over time.
Sometimes restrictive practices are misused. This can be accidental, for example, because someone didn't follow a person's plan properly. Systemic, for example, because a person's plan hasn't been reviewed properly or updated. And deliberate, where someone uses restrictions to control a person's behaviours or actions.
Sometimes they're used in the wrong way.
Sometimes they are used too long. Sometimes they get used.
Or misused.
Sometimes it's a better way.
It helps to think of restrictive practices in relation to human rights and the impact that these practices have on the person you are supporting.
Well, how would you feel if this thing happened to you?
They make people think something wrong with me.
It can make other people think people are dangerous.
The use of restrictive practices may cause and multiply the effects of trauma.
These practices rarely lead to long-term behavioural change.
Some people might experience restrictions for many years, even though the behaviour of concern are no longer there. It just becomes part of the way of doing things. But most of all, because when we start talking about people in terms of their behaviours, we might miss what someone is actually trying to tell us through their actions. Ask yourself, how are these practices benefiting the person?
It's hard to know sometimes whether you're doing the right thing.
You can also think about restrictive practices in relation to the zero tolerance empowerment circle. How do we move from the red or orange into the green so that people are empowered?
When there's lots to do, it's easy to forget how important it is to really listen to people.
Just try saying again, but sometimes they don't listen.
We need to remember that what some people call behaviours are a form of communication.
Make sure people have the right to communicate.
See the person, not the behaviour.
You don't need to do this alone. You don't need to be the expert. You just need to be attentive and listen. This means listening not just to what someone is saying through their words, but also through sounds, movements, expressions, and behaviour. These videos will help you to recognise where restrictive practices may be in use and feel confident to question how you could be doing things differently.
Get to know people, be proactive about supporting them, and ask yourself, what are people trying to tell you?
Listen. Listen.
Listen to me.
All right. So just refer to a couple of, refers to the videos in that presentation, and we will provide you with links to access those videos if you are interested. I'm just going to open up my presentation again. Give me 2 secs. So reflecting on the video, the 3 key points that I want you to take away when you're thinking about restrictive practices are that they are restrictions on participants' human rights. So they have the effect of changing the way that participants move or changing the way that they access parts of their environment, including items in their environment. We need to be very cautious when we're making decisions to prescribe restrictive practices, because in effect, we are prescribing a restriction on somebody's human rights. So it's really important that we carefully consider the ethical implications of that in line with the safety implications of the participants' behaviours of concern. The other point is that restrictive practices are implemented to keep participants or the people around them safe. I can almost guarantee that every behaviour support practitioner on this call has had someone explain that a restrictive practice is not a restrictive practice, it's for safety, right? And by definition, that is correct. The restrictive practice should be for safety. If it's not needed for safety, then why would it be needed at all? Why would we want to restrict someone's human rights if we're not restricting those rights in order to keep somebody safe? And the last point is that restrictive practices should only be used in response to behaviours of concern. We shouldn't be implementing restrictions on participants' human rights unless there is something occurring, a behaviour from that participant that is putting them in a position where they are unsafe. We don't just lock people in their houses. We don't prevent them from accessing their cupboards. We don't mechanically restrain them unless there is a behaviour occurring that necessitates that intervention. So in order for us to ethically prescribe a restrictive practice, behaviour support practitioners have to demonstrate that the intervention meets 5 legislative criteria. When we say legislative, effectively, we're saying it is the law that we are able to demonstrate that the intervention meets these criteria, and we do that through the collection of evidence and clinical analysis of the behaviour of concern in consideration of the restrictive practice. So the 5 criteria are listed here. And when looking at the concept of a restrictive practice being a last resort, we need to be able to demonstrate that the restrictive practice is the last resort or the last available intervention that can be used to manage the behaviour of concern. We need to be able to demonstrate that we've tried a bunch of different things and this is the last option that we have remaining available to us. In terms of reducing risk, we need to demonstrate that the restrictive practice reduces risks associated with the behaviour of concern. We need to consider the nature, likelihood, and impact of those risks as well. So, for example, it doesn't make sense to physically restrain someone in response to verbal aggression, because what does holding down someone's arms do in relation to the risk presented by them verbalizing threats of harm, swearing at people, calling them names? Physically restraining them is not going to stop them from doing those things. So it's not really an intervention that's going to be reducing the risk. We also need to consider whether or not the restrictive practice is the least restrictive intervention available to manage the behaviour of concern, and whether or not that restrictive practice is used in the least restrictive way possible. So an example we can consider here is, would we need to physically restrain someone from leaving their accommodation if we lock the front doors and that has the same effect? So if the doors are locked, they can't really leave anyway. So is it absolutely necessary that we physically restrain them as well? Probably not the least restrictive option there. In terms of shortest use possible, we need to demonstrate that the restrictive practice is only used for the length of time that is required to respond effectively to the risks identified. And we also need to consider when we will review the use of that restrictive practice. So an example to illustrate how we look for this criteria: if a participant is going to abscond when their best support worker, their most favourite support worker ever, leaves their house, they're going to run down the street after them. Do we need to lock the door, the front door, all the time, or only when we know that that person is leaving the house? For the shortest use possible, we only lock the door for that period of time when it is necessary to reduce risk. Outside of that time, we keep the door unlocked and we leave the participant to do what they want. And then lastly, under proportionate to risks, we need to consider the risks that are associated with the restrictive practice and whether or not they're proportionate to the risks that are associated with the behaviour of concern. So, for example, physical restraint carries serious risks of injury and death, and the behaviour of concern that physical restraint is used in response to needs to be proportionate in terms of the risks that it presents to the participant or the people around them. So, absconding, we probably don't want to be introducing a physical restraint in response to something like absconding, because the risks in that case are probably not balanced. So what behaviour support practitioners need to do in order to demonstrate that a restrictive practice meets the rationale criteria is to just collate as much evidence as possible. Evidence comes in a variety of different forms. Number one is incident reports. So these are the short kind of snapshots of a participant's behaviour that will provide us with information about the risk that that behaviour presents to the participant or others. So there might be scrawled notes from support workers, they might be more concrete, comprehensive notes from accommodation providers. Whatever it is, we look at that information and we see what it was that happened. So what was the behaviour that the participant engaged in, and what was the outcome for that participant or for the people around them. We can also look at outcome reports. So these are things that are going to demonstrate the less restrictive strategies that have been trialled in response to the behaviour of concern and what their effect on the behaviour and the associated risks were. We're going to be able to see whether or not there are least restrictive options that can be trialled with the participant, and if they are already being trialled, whether or not they're being used in the right way to have that maximum effect on the behaviour of concern. And we can also just generally document our evaluation of the risks of the restrictive practice as compared to the risks of the behaviour of concern. Having documented, robust risk analysis in this case is essential, because we need to demonstrate that we are actually thinking of this criteria when we're prescribing a restrictive practice. It's not good enough to just kind of go, yeah, it's fine, they're balanced, I guess. We want to demonstrate that we've actually thought through what all of the different risks associated with both the restrictive practice and the behaviour of concern are, and how we've made that comparison and come to the conclusion of whether or not it's proportionate. The Biggest takeaway that I want to leave you with, just in terms of the general concept of restrictive practices, is that they are neither good or bad. Restrictive practices are neutral. They are practices that are used in response to participants' behaviours of concern to keep them safe. And though they are restrictions on people's human rights, when they are used in the right circumstances, for the right purposes, in the right way, they are actually supporting our participants to live a full and meaningful life. We need to reduce and eliminate them over time. Absolutely. We should always be trying to eliminate all restrictive practices, but that doesn't mean that they are bad. They are just the interventions that are used at the time to keep the participant and the people that support them safe. And we need to work with all stakeholders, including the participant, to reduce them over time through skill building and alternative intervention. Don't ever get caught up in demonizing restrictive practices and saying you can't do this, it's got to stop right now. It is what it is. We work through it. We work with stakeholders. We collaborate. Alrighty, Tracy.
Thanks, Ellie. So I just wanted to touch on mechanical restraint and talk from both the perspective of an occupational therapist prescribing, or it might be a physiotherapist or another allied health professional, but the relationship to positive behaviour support as well. So we can define mechanical restraint as the use of a device to prevent, restrict or subdue a person's movement for the primary purpose of influencing a person's behaviour. So I guess I just want you to really think about the primary purpose of influencing a person's behaviour. When we're not prescribing the device for that reason, we're looking at it being more a therapeutic device, but it's just good to keep that in the back of our mind. So if we were to look at the different types or common mechanical restraints that we would come across in practice, it might be splints, gloves, helmets. There's quite a list there. And I guess it's just coming back to that definition of them items being prescribed for the primary purpose of influencing a person's behaviour. So there's quite a few on that list that you would prescribe for therapeutic purposes. So, and we'll touch on that further as well. There's one topic here that I just wanted to bring to people's attention because there may be state-based differences. So seatbelt buckle guards, I definitely always consider that is, or in the assessment process, consider it to be a restrictive, a mechanical restraint, and work through all of the clinical reasoning around that. But there are state jurisdictions around safe transportation that sometimes will say that seatbelt buckle guards are not a restrictive practice. Ellie, did you want to chat or talk through that a little bit further?
Yeah, absolutely. So in most states and territories, and I'm based in Victoria, so I speak to our legislation more specifically. Make sure you always do the double check of what applies to you. But it is not considered a restrictive practice to use a seatbelt buckle guard in a moving vehicle. Note, moving vehicle, because it is a legal requirement for all occupants of a vehicle to be wearing an appropriately fitted seatbelt while the vehicle is in motion. With that said, we should always work backwards from the idea that something is restrictive and work to rule it out as a restraint rather than working to rule it in, because that is the most conservative, safest approach for the participant. It may be that it has that dual effect of, it's restricting the participant, it's responding to behaviour, and we can document that, but typically it won't need to be reported as a restrictive practice because it's considered a legal requirement. To quickly answer Bridget's question, child lock is also the same. I would refer you to the Safe Transportation Guide that is published by the NDIS to get some more specific detail, and then make sure you refer to your state and territory legislation in making those decisions.
So devices that we would commonly use for a therapeutic purpose is not a mechanical restraint. So some examples of that is devices that help people with their everyday function or help their injuries to heal. So these devices can only be prescribed by qualified health professionals, and they would commonly be the prescribers of the therapeutic device. So again, these devices are not being prescribed for the reasons of restricting someone's movement or behaviour or in response to a behaviour of concern. They are about enhancing function, supporting a person in their daily life. So in terms of behaviour support practitioners, really it's just about seeking that evidence that the therapeutic device has been thoroughly assessed with clear protocols for use. So if we looked at some specific examples of what we would classify as a therapeutic device, so lots of options are out there, but postural supports, for example, it might be in a wheelchair or a postural chair, a static chair, that supports safe swallowing or assists the person to maintain an upright posture in the chair. So again, that is about enhancing their function. It's not about reacting to a behaviour of concern. Another one is wheelchairs that are used to support people who are unable to walk or cannot walk long distances, and we'll go into a case study about that later. But you can see how if we don't have really clear guidelines of how it is prescribed and why, that it could end up being used as a restrictive or a mechanical restraint. Cast slings or splints. And these devices, when used to support healing from injury or support physical function for long-term impairment. So someone who's wearing a wrist splint for rheumatoid arthritis, for example, that is about supporting and enhancing their function. It's not about restricting their movement. So chairs and stools to support safe showering, but if we were to demand someone use them when it's not necessary, you can see how that might be able to transition into more restrictive practice. Wheelchair activity tables to support independent engagement in activities, or it might be a tray that a communication device is mounted to, for example. So without that, the person's not able to communicate freely, so it's not perceived as being a mechanical restraint. Any air mattresses for the purpose of pressure relief or a sleeping system for the purpose of postural correction, not about restricting a person's movement in response to some behaviours of concern. So if we were to consider examples where therapeutic devices can cross over into mechanical restraint. So we've just talked about activity tables, but when left in place outside of the activity, that can be seen as a mechanical restraint. A way of flipping that also is that we will mount a communication device to a tray on a wheelchair, for example. I've seen in community practice where, the client's communicating a lot via the communication device mounted to the tray. So the support workers have removed it because he's becoming disruptive, or that is restricting someone's freedom to communicate. So it becomes a restrictive practice by removing that device. So it's thinking through all of the different scenarios. So behaviour support practitioners and OTs need to collaborate to differentiate between what is therapeutic and what is behavioural purposes for a device. And we're very lucky within AAA that we've got access to work very closely with other disciplines, and also to reach out for additional support where you're feeling unsure. I think one key message that I deliver from today's session is that often a problem shared is a problem halved. So if you can collaborate with different professionals to share that duty of care, then the burden is eased for each person involved. We don't need to be experts in every area, and we tap into the skills of those around us. And just Just to finally touch base on making sure there's actually evidence and clear protocols in place for therapeutical and behavioural uses.
Beautiful. So now we're just going to work through that idea of collaboration between occupational therapy and positive behaviour support when it comes to identifying and prescribing mechanical restraints. So in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the behaviour support practitioner, we need to work through the following questions. So number one is, does the participant have a behaviour of concern? Is the participant engaging in behaviours that are going to be influenced by that therapeutic device? We need to think about the risks that are associated with the behaviours of concern and how the device might be being used to reduce or to mitigate those risks. Excuse me. And then, as I touched on, we need to think of how therapeutic devices, so this is not only mechanical restraints, but sometimes you will see therapeutic devices that have been prescribed by allied health professionals that might appear relatively innocuous on first look, but we need to consider how these might be changing the participant's behaviour. Are they having an influence that may indicate that they are a dual purpose device that is both restrictive and therapeutic at the same time? This is the idea of therapeutic devices being misused in a restrictive way, and this is something that we need to consider when looking at the different devices that are in place for our participants. One of the best ways to make the decision about whether or not a device is being misused is to consider whether or not there are robust procedures in place to minimise the restrictive impact of a device or to minimise misuse. We can look for evidence that is available from allied health professionals that might provide us with more information about why a device has been prescribed and how it is intended to be used to inform all of our responses to the questions listed here. What we should be aiming to do is to obtain information from the relevant allied health professional about why the device has been prescribed and how it is meant to be used. We should be able to see those protocols around how the device is fitted, when it is to be used, who's to put it on, how long it's used for, what are the checks and balances in place to make sure the participant is safe and comfortable. That information will help us to answer those questions on the previous slide. We should also aim to observe how the device is being used and confirm whether or not this is consistent with the directions of the allied health professional. When we are including restrictive practices within a behaviour support plan, we need to keep in mind that the procedure that we put into that behaviour support plan is the procedure that needs to be followed in order for that restrictive practice to be considered authorised. Any deviation from that procedure would be considered an unauthorised restrictive practice. Although it is the same device, the procedure that's being followed is no longer authorised and it's considered an unauthorised restrictive practice for that participant. Support workers can't decide to skip over steps 2, 3, and 4 because they take too much time. They are part of the process because they are there to mitigate risk to the participant and ensure the safety of everybody involved. We also need to conduct our functional behaviour analysis of the participant's behaviour of concern. This is going to provide us with information that will inform the fade-out plan for the restrictive practice. This will provide us with information about the alternative strategies that we can start to introduce to limit or reduce the reliance on the restrictive practice over time, and to support the participant to develop functionally equivalent replacement behaviours or those alternative behaviours that they can use to meet the function of the behaviour of concern that has necessitated the use of the restrictive practice in the first place. And in doing that functional behaviour analysis, we can also consider whether or not the device meets the legislative criteria required to validate the use of the restrictive practice. So the information that will support us to decide whether or not we're going to endorse the restrictive practice use within that behaviour support plan.
So from an occupational therapist, or it may be a physiotherapist or another allied health practitioner who are prescribing mechanical restraints or assistive technology, I guess the main thing is to obtain a clear understanding of why you're being asked or why you've decided to prescribe any type of assistive technology. And that clinical reasoning and the discussions from today will also help to increase awareness of whether there's any possibility that it's considered to be a mechanical restraint. So work through your clinical reasoning to determine all of the options, including if there are behaviour support alternatives. So as Ellie's mentioned, quite often if there's a device in place, we've got to work backwards to determine, well, was that necessary from the outset? What has changed? But if you're at the point of determining whether you will or won't prescribe something, it's considering all of the options. And if there is a more simple, less obtrusive behaviour support alternative. And I guess the main thing is, as I've said, we don't have to be experts. If you're not sure, seek support and guidance from other occupational therapists with appropriate experience. Reach out to colleagues in that PBS space, talk through it, share the load. I can't enhance that enough. So when we collaborate and onward refer to PBS practitioners, we get a new perspective and get their input to ensure we're fulfilling our duty of care. And duty of care is in a legal jargon sense, our ability to demonstrate that we've taken all reasonable steps to prevent harm. So in the case where you've prescribed an assistive technology item, we just want to be able to demonstrate that we've gone through all of the clinical reasoning and documented that clearly enough to ensure that we're not doing harm or inadvertently could cause harm. So we want to document the clinical reasoning for the item, including your specific prescribed procedure for use, with clear guidelines to ensure the device is used correctly. Why we're doing that is to reduce the risk of harm to the participant and to also minimise the risk of unnecessary restriction to that participant. So in considering our documentation, I guess we always like to think of best practice and to have a detailed plan relating to the device. Again, we don't want any devices to be misused. So we want to say very clearly how the device will be used, how long the device can be applied for and when it must be removed, what training people, including support workers, would need to be able to apply and take off the device safely, how the device will be reviewed, and how and when the goals will be evaluated. I think we all need to be very clear that when we prescribe an assistive technology device, whether it ends up being for therapeutic reasons or if it ends up being a mechanical restraint, nothing's forever and participants' needs change. If they exhibited a behaviour of concern once upon a time, that doesn't mean that it remains current forever. If they have a therapeutic need, it doesn't mean that those needs don't change over time. So it's just making sure that we've allowed for ongoing review and making sure our documentation is in place. One of the big issues that we face as prescribers of assistive technology is that under the NDIS, the family and decision maker and ultimately the participant are the people who have choice and control relating to their NDIS funding. So it may end up that they decline further involvement from us as prescribers, which can be really difficult. All we can do is make sure that we are explaining why we need to have continued involvement, helping to educate with all best intentions and the best communication in place. There are times where people will still feel that prescribers are just trying to create a workload for themselves, generate an income for themselves, and that they decline further intervention or involvement. All as I can say is make sure you document really clearly when that occurs and communicate that to all key stakeholders involved. Again, so everybody understands best practice would be to review. In this instance, it's been declined and outline the reasoning behind that to all key stakeholders.
All right, time to kind of put some things into practice. test our knowledge. We're going to collaborate and then share our collective clinical reasoning to workshop some best practice steps for the following participants. We have 2. We got through 1 last time. As always, I overestimated how much we would be able to get through in a single session. So we'll see how we go. We're going to talk about Sandra, who is in her early 60s and lives with an intellectual disability. She mobilises within her home independently, but when she goes out in the community, she experiences fatigue and has had a number of falls. In the community, she now uses a basic folding manual wheelchair to promote her being able to go on extended community outings that she enjoys. The support workers have reported that Sandra becomes very excitable and stands up from her wheelchair when they are taking her out. And so they've asked for a seatbelt to be added to Sandra's wheelchair. These are the questions that we're going to work through. So if you've not participated in a group supervision with me before, easiest way for us to manage the conversation is to use the raise your hand function, and we'll call on different people as we go. But the questions we're wanting to answer, what factors do we need to consider? Is the wheelchair a mechanical restraint? Is the seatbelt a mechanical restraint? And what would need to be considered if prescribing a seatbelt in this situation? I'm going to flick back to the case study so that you can see it, but I'm keen to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts? What do we need to consider? Emily.
So I wouldn't consider the wheelchair itself as a restraint because it's for her mobility. So she wouldn't be able to get around without it. And I guess the fact she's standing up shows that she's not restrained by it.
Yes. Could that wheelchair be restrictive? She does mobilise independently in her home, sorry.
Yes, yeah. I guess I was thinking more out in the community. I don't think so, because by the sounds of it, if it's parked, say, she could just get out when she wanted to and she could do that safely.
Good. I want you to think about, is there a difference between, hey, Sandra, here's your wheelchair if you need it, it's there when you need it. And Sandra, we're going to the shop, get in your wheelchair.
Ah, righto, sorry, I've misinterpreted the case.
Oh, no.
Sure. Yeah, so if they're making her get in it when she could actually walk, then I would say, yes, that's restrictive. I had thought that when she sees it going in the bus or wherever they're going, then don't worry, my brain.
You definitely haven't misinterpreted it. Absolutely. We don't give you enough detail to kind of make that distinction. But yes. I just wanted to put it out there, right? Because that's how nitty gritty we sometimes need to be from a procedural perspective, that support workers can't kind of enforce use of the wheelchair in this sense, because then it could be considered restrictive. They need to ensure the participant has choice and control.
I've even had one that is almost the same, where they wanted her to be in the wheelchair all the time, and I had said no, like let her walk as far as she can walk, and then put it in there. Or I think we'd had in busy environments, then she was to get in the wheelchair if they were going into a busy shopping centre or a hospital or something.
That's where it really comes down to, as the prescriber, having very clear guidelines, doesn't it? So that there's less room for it being misused.
Yeah, and then I also, it's probably going slightly sideways, but I give them a copy to put on, and then because that SDA, I was concerned it would not be necessarily followed or communicated to everybody. I laminated a copy and I stuck it to hung it off the back of the wheelchair so that people would know.
Create the least amount of loopholes and scope for error as possible. Cool. What else do we need to think about?
Just reading, Ellie, that Chelsea's mentioned, great point again. You know, we're assuming the wheelchair has been clinically reasoned and stepped through, but yeah, she's raised wheelchair versus giving her regular breaks and giving her some control during community outings. So that's excellent.
I might just whip through the questions in the chat really quickly, because Bridget has asked, can she unbuckle the seatbelt herself? This is an interesting question, and it's one that comes up really often in the mechanical restraints space. I learned recently, which I'm very, it's uncomfortable to admit as a clinical lead that I'm always learning, but it actually doesn't matter. So whether or not a participant has the capacity to, pull bed rails up and down, unbuckle their seatbelt, all of that kind of stuff actually doesn't preclude that device from being a mechanical restraint. We need to work backwards from that idea of, is it influencing their behavior in any way, and make our decision on that basis alone. So potentially, I would assume in this case, she probably can unbuckle it herself if she wants to, but that wouldn't necessarily kind of rule out mechanical restraint in this space. Rebecca has also asked, is there a fine line here around safety? Yes, restrictive practices are always used for safety. And so that's the consideration that we need to make around the concept of a falls risk, right? So what is the kind of information that we would be looking for to inform whether or not this restrictive practice is needed for safety? We'd be looking for incident reports. What has been the history of injury? How often are we standing up? How often are we falling? So many questions that we can ask to help us make those decisions.
I also question too, as an OT, just looking at the in a different light, if she's experiencing fatigue and stuff like that, what's her posture like in that wheelchair, and does she actually need a pelvic harness, like a pelvic seatbelt, for safety? As an OT, I don't necessarily prescribe anyone to use a wheelchair without a pelvic harness because of the safety issues, particularly out in the community around that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I think that's where, as clinicians going in, you can see why we've provided a fairly generic case study, because we can jump to the end and prescribe a wheelchair without thinking through, well, what are the other options and is that the best option? So we don't want you to feel fearful that every time you prescribe a wheelchair, it's suddenly being considered as a mechanical restraint. It's just so that we think through the clinical reasoning, and especially in relation to the seatbelt, it's there's a lot of information we don't know here, isn't there? So, is prescribing a seatbelt proportionate to the risk that's there? As Ellie was saying, well, how often has she been trying to stand up? Was that a one-off situation, or is it every time they've been going out? Is it triggered by a certain environment that she visually sees? What other strategies have support workers tried before reaching the point of saying a seatbelt's required?
All right, we've got a couple of hands up. Let's work through them. Christy.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. I'm an OT, but wheelchairs aren't necessarily my main area of practice. So coming in thinking like, oh, like for an ambulating wheelchair user, I'm like, how could that be restrictive? But yeah, really interesting points around, like, if you're propelled by someone else, that really does limit the options that you have with interacting and engaging in the world. So yeah, very interesting to think about. My other thought in relation to like her disability and her intellectual capacity, like if she's, jumping up with excitement, like are there education? Are there other like much less restrictive processes that have been tried before moving to like, oh, well, she needs to be wearing a seatbelt, rather than, educating, communicating, working from that approach first?
Yeah, and that's that idea of those least restrictive interventions. So thinking about the behavior, and Emily Heard, I just saw your comment in the chat. I will come back to it, I promise. But thinking about that behavior and why is that happening? Surely there are other ways that we would be able to manage that behavior without necessarily needing to leap to, let's introduce a restrictive intervention. You also made a really interesting point around, if it's I don't know the technical term, but if someone else is pushing the wheelchair, how does that limit the participant's capacity to then make decisions about where she goes? Where is she allowed to kind of walk to and what environments can she access and people can she interact with. And you would need to have some fairly robust procedures in place around how that's going to operate practically in the community, because it's a really difficult space to navigate. PJ.
Hi, I just wanted to clarify, what's her communication like? Because I get the safety and I get the belt and everything, but if she can't communicate that she wants to go out and the support workers aren't listening to her or unable to understand what she's saying, then it would probably side more of a restrictive practice than not.
Absolutely. And I guess that's why we've tried to keep it more general, to really harvest these conversations, because we don't want the answer. Really, this is about what extra information do we need from this situation, so we don't, as prescribers, become vulnerable to just hopping in and prescribing a seatbelt when there might be really logical intervention that can happen without providing a seatbelt. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. We want to know more about her intellectual disability. I'm just reading, Emily's also put in the chat about a social story teaching her when and how to use the wheelchair and how to be a safe passenger. Brilliant stuff. This is all the discussions we want to have, because at the end of the day, if I was asked to prescribe a seatbelt for a wheelchair, I would want to know, well, is it in response to a behaviour of concern? Let's say they've said standing up from the wheelchair is the behaviour of concern. I want to know, well, why is she standing up? What is it that's exciting her? And should we be limiting that? Is it that she's trying to stand up when you're crossing a road, for example? Whether it's proportionate to the risk is a huge question here, isn't it? And is it the last resort?
Taryn.
I had one almost identical recently. And firstly, I want to say thanks to all the OTs out there that we pick their brains as a PBS clinician. But I was told exactly the same thing. There was a seatbelt attached to the wheelchair because this participant gets up and down. In my particular case, it ended up being the lady I work with is a little bit older. I think she's like 50s. She has scoliosis, and it was less about the seatbelt and more about the foot plates, that when she gets up, she's at risk of falling. I couldn't have made that decision as a PBS clinician. So luckily she had an OT and I asked her to do the assessment. So that's, I guess, where I would go to the specialist person. Like I could look at it initially when they were talking to me about it, I was like, that's definitely RP, but I really needed someone that knew about wheelchairs and how they worked and the movement part of that to have a look at it before I could make that decision and have a look at that report as well.
Yeah. And I think it is so important to kind of recognize what is it within the scope of our own role. Like me describing the wheelchair as someone pushing the wheelchair when I know there is definitely a technical term for the kind of wheelchair that it is, kind of indicates where the limits of my scope are. And being able to say to stakeholders like, look, I can't make this decision on my own. I need to work with someone else to be able to provide an informed perspective, is probably the most powerful thing that we can do as practitioners. It is really uncomfortable to kind of sit in the idea that we don't know and to confront the idea that we don't know with the stakeholders that kind of expect us to be the experts on everything, but it's actually the best thing that we can do in all circumstances. It means you can get the right answers, you can make a clinically informed decision, even if it's not informed by your own clinical information, it's informed by someone else's. It's going to have a better outcome for the participant if we're able to work from that perspective. I just want to work through a couple of the comments in the chat. Chelsea pointed out that the seatbelt would restrict her from going to an area that she is interested in. Absolutely. So if the participant is belted into the wheelchair and she is standing up as a means to access another environment, then that seatbelt is restricting her, which is also the point that Raja had made as well. Amelia has suggested that it would be least restrictive to get a walker or a Zimmer frame if that is appropriate for this participant. And then Emily Hurd has made the very important point that is standing up when they are excited a behaviour of concern? It took a little while, but I'm glad we got there in the end. Is it a behaviour of concern for someone to stand up out of their wheelchair when they're excited? Behaviour support practitioners, have a think about what is the definition of a behaviour of concern. What do you think?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. So can we be prescribing a restrictive practice in response to excitement? Probably not. It's probably not necessary, right? Emily, as we, other Emily, so many Emilys today, made that suggestion around social stories and being a safe passenger in the wheelchair. And then Daniel has made the suggestion of providing both options of walking and sitting on the wheelchair so that she can walk when she's not fatigued and then sit on the wheelchair when she is. That's a great suggestion, and it's absolutely how that protocol should look, is that the wheelchair accompanies us on community outings, and it is the participant's decision of when they use the wheelchair. Chelsea made the good point that PBS is all about the detail and asking all those really nitty-gritty, annoying questions. Matheson, is the same applicable if the wheelchair already comes with a seatbelt and use is recommended in the operational guide? That's an interesting point. Can our OTs kind of speak to that of like, what is, you know, wheelchairs presumably come with seatbelts in a lot of cases, right? So what do we do then?
I'll open that up for the group to have a think about, Ellie, because yeah, there are lots of factors to consider, aren't there? Does anyone want to speak to that?
Emily?
So I found, depending on the chair, like quite a few of the transit chairs do come just with a seatbelt as part of it. Personally, I talk to the person using it, their family, whoever's going to be the attendant pushing it, to find out. I found quite a few people choose to wear it because they just feel more secure. And in that case, I don't consider that restrictive practice because they've chosen to use it themselves. And a lot of the time for others, we either remove it or just like do it up, wrap it around the back. So it's hanging out at the back there should the person choose to use it, but it's not really needed. I'm not quite sure why it's often just as a part of default.
Standard.
Yeah.
And
Any
so
other comments about that?
I do find people request lap belts quite a lot, but I often don't give them. Something which I also keep in mind with lap belts is if they're loose and the person's unattended and slide down, then they can become more of a hazard and cause injury and choking and things. So, but I think a lot of people just put it on because it's on the wheelchair without thinking any further than that.
And we have to really listen to participants too. For example, spinal cord injured clients would find it quite insulting to have a seat belt put onto a wheelchair unless it was for postural assistance or guidance. So, and one spinal cord injured client actually pointed out to me that, you know, if he were to hit a curb, because you know, they can be very active users. So if they were to hit a curb, they would rather fall out of the chair themselves than have the chair topple on top of them. So it's just thinking about, yeah, is it why are we actually prescribing it? Is it just because it's there? They're usually looped around and very easily removed. So it's just having the reasoning behind why it would be used in each scenario, isn't it?
And for behaviour support practitioners, it's considering that choice and control of the participant, which doesn't preclude the intervention of the device from being restrictive, but also whether or not it's in response to a participant's behaviour of concern. If they're reporting concerns around safety because they don't feel secure in the chair, and we've been able to consult with an OT in terms of ruling out those risks, then provided it's not kind of influencing a behavior of concern, we can proceed with caution and kind of make the assessment that it wouldn't be a restrictive practice in that case. I also want to point out that I sometimes come across as really dramatic when we're doing restrictive practice consultation for these high risk restraints, where I'm like, physical restraint carries high risk of death, mechanical restraint carries high risk of choking and death and all of these things, but it can happen, right? And we actually have to think in worst case scenarios a lot of the time, because that is what we are here to kind of prevent for participants and the people who support them. So as dramatic and unlikely as I seem, I come across as a little bit unhinged, we do sometimes need to think in those terms in order to be making the right decisions in this space. Any other questions or thoughts around this case study? Matheson?
Just a question with what you were saying before. So if a client has the capacity to make a decision that if it is a mechanical restraint, for example, so take the seatbelt, they have the capacity to make the decision, so I want to wear it for safety. Were you saying that we still have to consult with an OT or something to confirm it's then no longer restrictive? Because if they've, I guess, given the permission or seller, this is what I want, wouldn't we just then take that at the face value as long as they can make that decision?
It's not about whether or not it's restrictive, it's about the safety. So if a participant who perhaps doesn't, and I'm going to use technical terms I have no right to be using, but you know, if they've got poor trunk control or muscle tone or anything like that, as Emily kind of suggested, you know, the participant can slide down in the chair and kind of be choked by their wheelchair seatbelt. So we need to make sure that we've considered those elements of the device before, I guess, you know, supporting the participant. You know, we support the participant to exercise choice and control, but we make sure that they're informed around all those kind of safety aspects and risk aspects as well. And we've worked with them to identify the safest option for them to meet that security need that they're expressing. Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Sometimes the simpler the case study is, the harder it is to get your head around. But let's say, for example, I've got a very fresh cerebral palsy client who is very capable of making his own decisions and communicating clearly what he wants, but he wanted the support workers to apply his postural support harness but leave his pelvis free, because that meant he felt he could move more easily in his wheelchair. That straight away, there's a huge safety risk, isn't there? So had to work very closely with him around that being a safety issue, and that the wheelchair has been prescribed with the pelvic belt and the harness. Can never use the harness without the pelvic belt. So working really closely with him and the support workers around all of the history, and then working out at a certain time of day, he just likes to be free from having his pelvic belt because it sits quite firmly. So we looked at another postural chair, so that between 3 and 4 p.m. was kind of his chill out time to watch telly in his postural chair, but he didn't have to have the pelvic belt or the harness on in that chair. So, but you can see if you just thought, well, he's capable of making that decision, so, you know, we could tick that off, but the harness is actually a huge risk to him without the pelvic belt.
All right, I am conscious of the time, so I did want to throw it out to general questions before we close off today's meeting. I'm going to skip over case study 2, but we will add it to a document that we've pulled together with supporting resources for you. We encourage you to take a case study away and speak to your supervisor about it and just work through practicing that clinical reasoning piece. But yes, before we close off, general questions about mechanical restraint. Chelsea?
I'm just wondering, has anybody got experience with like maybe a 5-year-old and he's obviously still in a car seat, but then there's a clip together one at the top, so you've got the buckle at the bottom and then the buckle at the top between kind of on the chest?
Is it pretty standard for a car seat for a kid of that age?
I'm not too sure. That's what I'm asking. Yeah, because I'm not a parent, so
I'm
is it
also
pretty
not a parent.
standard? Yeah, is it pretty standard for a 5-year-old to have that? It's just I'm supporting someone that's got a client that has got that. So
I would
Yeah, I
perhaps.
think that's
go.
a really great question. Sorry, Chelsea, you're OT or
No, PBS.
PBS? Yeah.
Maybe it goes down to what the seatbelt, like the instructions and everything with the seatbelt to really recognise if it's part of how it needs to be done for safety. Do you think?
And has it been prescribed by somebody? Yeah, you know, a qualified practitioner, and going back to why it was prescribed, what the instructions for use, because in the PED space it very much does come down to what is age appropriate, and you know, at 5 years of age generally, you're not going to a specialised sort of harness. So, you know, without knowing all of the facts, that obviously you'd need to be ticking it off that it's a mechanical restraint.
Matheson?
So I was going to kind of go on the opposite of that one, to be honest with you. Like, if it's not something that's been specifically built or anything for his clients, something that's picked up from Big Dub or Kmart, then that's just the operational, I guess, standard of that seatbelt, that harness. Like, I'd go the exact opposite way on that one, to be honest, and say, well, if that's literally how it comes and that's meant to be the design of it, then that should be fine, really. Especially for a child that's 5, because they shouldn't really have the ability to undo the seatbelt themselves, because then that would propose another safety risk.
I think if we kind of generalize that logic, though, we have the potential to bring ourselves into a couple of risky points, because there are a lot of things that you can buy from the supermarket that you can use in a way that would be considered a restrictive practice. I think it's more about looking at the safe transport laws in your state and territory, Chelsea, and then looking at the operating guide for the device and the device. It makes it sound like very robotic. For the car seat, and just inquiring gently with the family around, okay, well, why this? Why have we, because you've mentioned now that it's question whether or not it's an add-on.
It's not my client, so I thought I'd just start the conversation because it's an interesting one, you know, like versus is it an add-on because he's trying to get out of it?
Yeah.
Or is it, or was it part of the seat when it was bought? Yeah.
And I'd be working through all of that reasoning, because what we can potentially do, and this came up in a high-risk restraint consult that I facilitated with Mary, who's the clinical lead for PEDS. What you can do in introducing harnesses or maintaining use of harnesses beyond the recommended age is create a reliance or a dependence on the harness really early in a child's life that is related to behavior of concern that then prolongs the use of that device like beyond childhood, right? So we're not looking at the alternative ways of engaging the child during transport that would reduce the need for that harness over time. We go, oh, well, part of the car seat when they were 5, so we just like carry on indefinitely forever without exploring the less restrictive options. So it may not be restrictive at 5, but once the child kind of ages out of the requirement to use the car seat, we still need to use a harness because they've not been able to develop the skills to be a safe passenger, and we need to maintain a restrictive intervention to keep everyone safe in the car ongoing. So a whole bunch of stuff to just factor in.
I think that's a really good point about, you know, not building the skills and things like that, and then the client being reliant on it. Yeah, because early years is so important for development.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Last time, any other questions? If you do need support around restrictive practice identification or prescription, please refer your case through to the multidisciplinary consultation service via the Clinical Excellence email. Just send us an email request with a couple of the case details and we'll be able to book you in for a consultation with the right people. But otherwise, if you have any questions or feedback, please reach out to either myself or Tracy. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your Monday and we'll see you next month.
Just a quick shout out. We will pop in each